The afternoon sun, usually a benevolent golden blanket over the meticulously manicured lawns of Eagle Ridge Estates, felt like a spotlight on Mark's growing anxiety. His gaze kept drifting to the drainage ditch that ran along the back of his property, a natural gully carved by generations of seasonal runoff, a silent guardian against the whims of the hillside. For years, it had done its job admirably, channeling excess water from the higher elevations, ensuring the homes below remained dry and secure. Then Karen moved in. Her property, directly uphill from Mark's, had been vacant for months after old. Mrs. Henderson passed, a quiet, unobtrusive plot. Karen, however, was neither quiet nor unobtrusive. Her arrival had been heralded by the roar of earth-moving equipment and the relentless chatter of construction crews. She was, as she'd proudly declared at the first HOA meeting she deigned to attend, modernizing her space. The modernization soon extended to the drainage ditch. Mark first noticed it as a small, tastefully arranged pile of decorative river stones near her property line, just at the edge of the ditch. He thought little of it, perhaps an aesthetic enhancement, but the pile grew. Stones became bags of concrete. Concrete became a low, sturdy wall, deliberately redirecting the ditch's natural flow. Then came the raised garden beds, brimming with exotic, thirsty plants, encroaching further and further into the channel. He'd tried to be neighborly. "Karen," he'd begun, catching her one evening as she supervised the planting of a particularly aggressive-looking shrub. "That drainage ditch is pretty important for everyone down here, especially with the rainy season coming up. You sure you want to build those beds so close to it?" Karen, a woman whose platinum blonde bob seemed sculpted from solid confidence, had barely glanced up from her phone. "Mark, darling," she'd chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It's an eyesore, and drainage ditch sounds so primitive. I'm simply beautifying my property. Besides," she'd finally met his gaze, a glint of something cold in her blue eyes. "I hired the best landscapers. They assured me it's perfectly fine. A few garden beds aren't going to cause a flood, are they?" She'd laughed, a brittle sound, and turned back to her phone, dismissing him entirely. Mark had clenched his jaw. He'd lived in Eagle Ridge for 15 years, seen enough flash floods and runoff surges to know the delicate balance the ditch maintained. He'd seen the HOA bylaws. Article 7, Section C. No permanent structures or landscaping alterations shall impede natural water flow through designated drainage channels. He'd presented it politely to Karen via email, attaching a copy of the bylaw. Her reply had been a single dismissive line. "My landscapers are experts. Trust them." His next step was the HOA board. Mr. Henderson, the board president, was a well-meaning man, but slow-moving and obsessed with maintaining property values, which Karen's modernization was certainly doing, at least superficially. "Mark, I understand your concern," Henderson had said over the phone a week later, "but Mrs. Dubois has invested a substantial amount. Her landscapers submitted plans. They showed a revised flow. Minor adjustments, they said." "Minor adjustments?" Mark had exploded, the politeness finally cracking. "She's practically filled it in, Robert. With another wet winter predicted, we're going to have a problem." Henderson sighed. "Look, I'll send a letter, a formal request for her to review the impact. But these things take time, Mark. We can't just demand she rip up her brand, new garden." Time was precisely what Mark felt they didn't have. The sky had been brooding for days, a heavy, bruised purple that spoke of impending deluge. Weather reports were grim, a series of atmospheric rivers, unprecedented rainfall, flash, flood warnings for the entire region. Each drop that fell felt like a personal affront, a ticking clock against Karen's stubborn ignorance. He'd driven past her house again that morning. Her beautification was complete. The ditch, once a clear, albeit sometimes muddy channel, was now a mere indentation, almost entirely choked by the concrete-lined garden beds. Her landscapers had even installed a quaint, ornamental bridge over what little remained of the original flow, a final mocking touch of aesthetic over function. The plants, expensive and vibrant, seemed to mock the burgeoning storm, their roots greedily soaking up the already saturated soil. That afternoon, the first real wave hit. It wasn't just rain. It was a horizontal assault, driven by a furious wind that lashed the trees and rattled windows. Mark stood at his back window watching, his stomach a knot of dread. He saw the water pooling rapidly in what used to be the free-flowing section of the ditch on his property, just below Karen's obstruction. The water level rose, sluggish and resentful, a dark mirror reflecting the gray sky. Then, with a sound like a wet gasp, the concrete retaining wall Karen had built, the one her experts had assured her was perfectly fine, began to weep. A thin, dark line of moisture appeared near its base, expanding, darkening. A small crack, almost imperceptible at first, spiderwebbed across the smooth gray surface. A pebble dislodged, then a handful of mud, oozing from the fissure. The ornamental bridge, now underwater, seemed to sag. Mark felt a chilling certainty. This wasn't going to be just a flood. This was going to be something far, far worse. And it was just getting started. The crack in Karen's concrete wall widened with an audible groan, a sound swallowed almost immediately by the renewed fury of the rain. Mark watched in horror as a torrent of mud and water, thick and dark like crude oil, began to sluice through the fissure. It wasn't just pooling. It was actively eroding the ground beneath, undermining the very foundation of the beautified ditch. His breath hitched as he saw the ornamental bridge Karen had so proudly installed give way, not with a crash, but with a slow, sickening tilt. Its delicate arch now mimicking a broken spine as it disappeared beneath the churning brown. He didn't hesitate. Grabbing his phone, he fumbled with the cold, wet keys to his back door. The wind tore at his jacket as he stepped outside, the deluge immediately soaking him to the bone. He had to warn someone, anyone. His fingers, numb with cold and urgency, tapped out Robert Henderson's number. "Robert! It's Mark. It's happening, just like I said. Karen's wall is failing. The ditch. It's a disaster up here," he yelled into the phone, straining to be heard over the roar of the storm. There was a moment of static, then Henderson's voice, tight with panic. "What? Failing? Mark, slow down. Are you seeing actual damage?" "Actual damage? Robert, the bridge is gone. Mud is pouring through the wall. It's not holding. And the water level, it's insane down here. The runoff from the hill is just piling up." Mark's voice cracked with a mix of fear and frustrated rage. "You need to get people out of their homes. This isn't just my property. This is the entire street. The entire slope is compromised." "Evacuation?" Henderson sounded incredulous, almost offended. "Mark, that's a drastic step. The HOA can't just sit on its hands while homes get swallowed," Mark roared, turning his back to the wind, trying to shield the phone. He could hear the distinct sound of snapping branches somewhere further up. The hill, a premonition of heavier things to come. "Get down here, Robert. Look for yourself, and call emergency services if you won't." He hung up, not waiting for a response. Henderson, bless his well-meaning but ultimately ineffectual soul, would probably spend another 20 minutes consulting bylaws before acting. Mark couldn't afford 20 minutes. His gaze swept across the darkening sky, then down the slope. Beyond his own property, the other houses, usually beacons of suburban tranquility, now looked impossibly vulnerable. The very thought sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through him. He had to do something more than just call. Running back inside, he grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and a spare battery pack. His wife, Sarah, was already at the living room window, her face pale, pressing a hand to her mouth. "Mark, what was that noise? The trees! And the water! It's coming up fast!" "It's Karen's ditch, honey. "It's completely compromised," he said, pulling on thick waterproof boots. "I have to go check on Mrs. Peterson. Her place is directly below us." "Mark! No! It's not safe! Look out there!" Sarah's voice was sharp with fear, but he was already halfway out the door. "I'll be careful. Just keep an eye on things here. And if anything feels wrong, get to the upstairs bathroom. It's the highest point." He plunged back into the maelstrom. The wind was a physical force pushing him sideways. The rain felt like needles, and the ground was already softening underfoot, sucking at his boots. He navigated his backyard, the beam of his flashlight cutting a shaky path through the gloom. The pooling water behind Karen's dammed ditch was now a small, turbulent lake, its surface roiling with debris, and the crack in the concrete wall was no longer a crack. It was a gaping maw through which a thick, viscous river of mud was now pouring, carrying with it small stones, uprooted plants, and what looked like a section of Karen's prize-winning rose bush. Then came the sound. It started as a low, guttural rumble, a deep tremor that vibrated through his very bones, distinct from the wind and rain. It was the sound of earth itself, shifting, groaning under an unbearable weight. He turned his flashlight beam uphill towards Karen's property. The manicured lawn, the exotic garden beds, they were no longer static. The ground was moving, slowly at first, a ripple, a heaving, then a distinct, terrifying slide. The entire section of Karen's backyard, including the ill-fated garden beds and the partially collapsed concrete wall, began to slide. It wasn't a rapid collapse, not yet, but an inexorable, terrifying creep. The ground seemed to breathe, then sigh, as huge clumps of earth detached and slid, picking up speed, gathering more debris, more water, more mud. The house itself, a modern architectural marvel, seemed to shudder. Mark felt his blood run cold. This wasn't just a localized washout. This was a mudslide, a real, honest-to-God mudslide, picking up momentum, heading directly down the slope. He turned, scrambling towards Mrs. Peterson's house, his movements clumsy in the thickening mud. He could hear the roar now, a hungry, crushing sound. He hammered on Mrs. Peterson's back door, yelling her name, his voice raw. "Mrs. Peterson, get out, now, mudslide!" The door finally opened a crack, revealing the frail, bewildered face of the elderly woman. "Mark? What in heaven's name? No time, Mrs. Peterson. Get out. Go to the front of the house, get in your car, and drive to the main road." He practically pulled her out, ushering her with a gentle but firm hand. He didn't wait for her to gather anything. Her life was all that mattered. As he pushed her towards her garage, another sound cut through the storm. A high-pitched, terrified shriek from uphill. Karen's house. He didn't have to look to know. The roar of the mudslide intensified, a monstrous wave of earth, water, and shattered landscaping now cascading down the slope, heading straight for his property. He shoved Mrs. Peterson into her car, screaming at her to go. "Drive! Now!" He barely registered her fumbling with the keys before the leading edge of the mudslide, a dark, frothing mass, slammed into his own backyard with the force of a battering ram. The sound was deafening, a sickening crunch of wood, splintering, glass, and the agonizing tear of earth. He saw his carefully tended rose garden vanish in an instant, devoured by the advancing tide. His shed, a solid structure, shuddered, then simply imploded. The back half of his house groaned, a sound of immense stress and yielding. And then, just as he was about to turn and run, a new, horrifying sound emerged from the chaotic din, a piercing, desperate cry for help, cutting through the storm from somewhere amidst the churning mud, distinctly from Karen's direction. It was followed by a loud, echoing crack, like a giant bone breaking, as a significant section of Karen's house, the modernized part, began to peel away from the main structure, crumbling into the churning torrent. Mark froze, soaked, terrified, his own home being torn apart before his eyes. But The scream, sharp and desperate, was Karen's, no doubt about it. It sliced through the cacophony of the storm and the grinding roar of the mudslide, pulling Mark's focus away from his own rapidly disintegrating home. A large section of Karen's house, the sleek glass and steel addition she'd been so proud of, was now tilting precariously, groaning like a dying beast as it began its slow, inevitable slide down the hill. He saw a flash of platinum blonde, hair through a shattered window, her face a mask of pure terror, pressing against the glass as if trying to push herself through it. His mind screamed at him to run, to save himself. Sarah, Mrs. Peterson, they were paramount. But the image of Karen's face, utterly stripped of her usual arrogance, replaced by raw, primal fear, gripped him. He hated her stubborn, self-serving actions that had brought this disaster, down on them all. Yet, he couldn't leave her. "Not like this! Karen!" he yelled, though his voice was swallowed by the storm. He started scrambling uphill, every step a struggle against the thickening, sucking mud. His boots were heavy, threatening to pull free, and he felt the ground beneath him shift, a terrifying reminder of the unstable earth. Debris, large and small, was now flowing freely down the slope. Splintered fence posts, a child's swing set, chunks of concrete from Karen's demolished garden beds. He dodged a rolling wheelbarrow, a grotesque parody of the domestic tranquility that had once defined Eagle Ridge. As he got closer to Karen's property line, the devastation became clearer. The main structure of her house was still somewhat intact, but the entire backyard, the carefully landscaped oasis she'd created, was gone, replaced by a raw, gaping wound in the earth. The mudslide had ripped through it like a giant, angry claw, exposing raw earth and snapping ancient tree roots. The section of her house that was sliding was her newly built sunroom, the one with the panoramic views. Now, those views were of nothing but churning brown. He could hear her again, a choked, desperate sob. She was trapped. Reaching what was left of her back patio, Mark saw the extent of it. The sunroom, now leaning at a sickening angle, had shifted and pinned Karen's leg beneath a fallen support beam. She was half in, half out of what used to be a sliding glass door, her hands frantically scrabbling at the mud and splintered wood around her. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, met his for a split second, a desperate plea passing between them. "Hold on, Karen!" Mark shouted, forcing himself through the rising tide of mud. The ground here was treacherous, slick with a watery top layer that concealed rocks and broken sections of concrete. He slipped, falling to one knee, a sharp pain shooting through his shin. Gritting his teeth, he pushed himself up, adrenaline burning through the pain. He reached her, sinking into the mud up to his thighs. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, crushed plants, and something metallic, probably a burst pipe. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" he asked, his voice strained. Karen shook her head, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rain. "My leg, it's pinned. I can't move it." Mark assessed the situation. The beam pinning. Her leg was massive, part of the sunroom's support structure. It was heavy, too heavy for him to lift alone, especially with the ground so unstable. He tried to brace himself against a surviving section of the patio wall, but it felt spongy, unreliable. The entire area was still moving, albeit slowly, with a continuous unsettling shudder. He scanned for anything at all, that could serve as a lever. His eyes fell on a thick, discarded piece of lumber, likely from the construction, half buried in the mud nearby. It was waterlogged and heavy, but might work. "Okay, Karen, I'm going to try and get this beam off you," he said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "It's going to take everything I've got. You need to pull with me when I push." She nodded, her lips trembling, still unable to speak. Mark lunged for the lumber, pulling it free from the mud with a grunt of effort. The rain hammered down, blinding him, but he positioned the end of the lumber under the edge of the beam, finding a small purchase point. "On 3, Karen! 1, 2, 3! He heaved with every ounce of strength he possessed, muscles screaming in protest. The beam groaned, shifting slightly, but it wasn't enough. Karen cried out, her legs still trapped. The lumber slipped, and he nearly lost his footing, tumbling backward into the churning mud. A fresh wave of earth slammed into the remnants of his own house further down the slope, a loud tearing sound echoing through the storm. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that his home was actively being destroyed. Sarah was safe, he prayed, upstairs, high and dry. But the thought of his property, his sanctuary, being consumed by this monstrous force added another layer of desperation to his efforts. He tried again, bracing his feet more carefully, finding a better angle for the lever. This time he focused, all his rage, all his fear, all his sheer, furious willpower into the effort. "Push, Karen, push!" With a supreme, agonizing effort, Mark leveraged the lumber. The beam scraped against the ground, grumbled, and then, with a sharp, wrenching sound, it lifted just enough. "Now, Karen!" Karen, fueled by terror, pulled her leg free with a guttural cry. Mark immediately let go of the lumber, which slammed, back down into the mud. He grabbed Karen by her arm, pulling her clear of the immediate danger zone. Her leg, visibly twisted and already swelling, was clearly broken. "We have to go! Now!" Mark yelled, half dragging, half carrying her towards the less compromised front of her house. The entire sunroom detached fully then, with a thunderous crash, tumbling down the slope, a broken, glittering cascade of glass and steel pulverized by the relentless mud. The ground under their feet shuddered violently, just as they reached the relative safety of her front porch. A sickening crack echoed from deep within the main house. A series of smaller, sharper sounds followed, like gunshots. The lights inside the house flickered, then died, plunging the interior into instant blackness. Mark looked back at the gaping maw where her backyard had been, then at the main structure of Karen's house. A new, terrifying crack, jagged and deep, had appeared across the entire foundation of the house, running right up the front facade. The front door, though still intact, was now crooked in its frame, jammed solid. They were trapped on the porch, between a crumbling house and the advancing mud. And then, from the main road, the piercing, unmistakable wail of a distant siren. Too far away, far too slow. Mark looked at Karen, her face streaked with mud and tears, her leg throbbing, her house literally tearing itself apart behind her. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the ultimate price for her arrogance was about to be paid. The image of Leo's tear-streaked face, his small, slumped shoulders radiating a profound, silent sadness, haunted Sarah for days. It was a persistent echo in her mind, a counterpoint to the incessant yapping of Karen's new dogs, Midnight and Sparkle, which now provided the new, grating soundtrack to her neighborhood. The dogs were relentless, their high-pitched barks slicing through the summer air, a constant reminder of the chaos Karen had invited into her own life. Sarah found herself observing Karen more closely, a grim, almost detached curiosity replacing her former fury. Karen, once so meticulously put together, now looked perpetually disheveled. Her platinum bob was often askew, her clothes smudged with dirt or dog hair. She chased the yelping duo around her yard, scooping up their prodigious messes, her once proud garden rapidly transforming into a patchwork of trampled plants and fresh excavations. The irony was a bitter pill. Karen, who had refused to control her children, was now utterly at the mercy of two small, fluffy tyrants. The children, Leo and Mia, were shadows of their former selves. Their boisterous energy had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, almost melancholic demeanor. Sarah often saw them sitting on their patio, watching their mother's futile attempts to wrangle the dogs, or simply staring listlessly at Sarah's now barren yard. They rarely played outside, and the sounds of their laughter, once a source of annoyance, were now conspicuously absent. The silence from next door was louder than any noise had ever been. Sarah's own emotional landscape was equally tumultuous. The initial rush of vindication had faded, leaving behind a gnawing emptiness. She missed her pool profoundly. The heat of the summer was relentless, and the thought of slipping into the cool blue water was a daily torment. Her backyard, once a vibrant extension of her home, felt sterile and unwelcoming. She found herself retreating indoors, the once-loved patio now a stark reminder of her drastic, irreversible decision. One afternoon, seeking escape from the oppressive quiet of her home and the relentless heat, Sarah decided to visit the community pool. It was a last resort. Always crowded, always noisy, but at least it offered relief. As she approached the entrance, she saw them. Karen, perched on the edge of a plastic lounge chair, scrolling furiously on her phone, while Leo and Mia splashed, half-heartedly in the shallow end, looking entirely out of place amidst the boisterous crowds. Their eyes met across the throng of people. Karen's face hardened instantly, a flicker of resentment and something else. Embarrassment? Crossing her features, she quickly looked away, pulling her children closer as if to shield them from Sarah's gaze. Sarah felt a pang, not of triumph, but of unease. This was not the simple victory she had imagined. The conflict had merely moved venues, and the stakes felt higher now, more public. Later that week, Sarah received a flyer in her mailbox. It was an advertisement for a new backyard oasis company specializing in custom-designed patios, fire pits, and, ironically, small above-ground hot tubs. She crumpled it, a wave of bitterness washing over her, the idea of transforming her barren yard into something new felt like a betrayal of her old dream and an admission of defeat in her war with Karen. She didn't want a new oasis. She wanted her old one back, but without the trespassers. The persistent dog barking, however, was starting to get to her. It wasn't just occasional, it was constant. Midnight and Sparkle seemed to have endless reserves of energy, their yaps echoing through the neighborhood from dawn until dusk. Sarah, trying to work from home, found her concentration shattered. Earplugs did little. She considered complaining to the HOA, but the thought of another direct confrontation with Karen, especially after what had transpired, filled her with dread. She had chosen her battle, and this new nuisance felt like collateral damage, a karmic kickback. Then, a subtle shift. Sarah noticed that Karen's blinds were no longer perpetually drawn. She saw Karen's car leaving and returning at odd hours, sometimes late at night. The dogs, though still yappy, were sometimes left inside, their muffled barks a slightly less invasive presence. There was a new, weary tension in Karen's posture, a hurriedness in her movements. It was more than just battling unruly pets. One afternoon, as Sarah was watering her front yard, she saw Mrs. Henderson again walking her small terrier. Mrs. Henderson stopped, her expression even more worried than before. "Sarah, dear," she began, lowering her voice, "have you seen Karen lately? She seems not herself, very stressed, and the children, they seem to be spending a lot of time alone." Sarah nodded, a knot forming in her stomach. "I've noticed. The dogs are a lot to handle." "Oh, it's more than the dogs, I think," Mrs. Henderson whispered, glancing around conspiratorially. "I heard a rumor. From Carol at the grocery store, you know how she hears everything. Apparently Karen's husband, Mark, he lost his job a few weeks ago. They're struggling, Sarah, really struggling. And the dogs? I heard they were a gift from his mother, trying to cheer up the children after the pool." Mrs. Henderson gestured vaguely towards Sarah's yard. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Mark lost his job. The dogs were a gift. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The frantic movements, the drawn blinds, the late-night disappearances. Karen wasn't just battling dogs, she was battling a crumbling life. And the pool removal, Sarah realized, With a jolt wasn't just an act of petty revenge. It was a devastating blow to a family already teetering on the brink. Her act, designed to inflict a minor inconvenience, had amplified a hidden crisis, adding profound emotional weight to an already fragile situation. The realization hit Sarah like a cold wave, colder than any pool water. Her triumph evaporated, replaced by a deep, chilling shame. She had been so consumed by her own anger, by her righteous indignation, that she hadn't seen the bigger picture. She had assumed malice, where there might have been desperation, or simply a woman overwhelmed and out of her depth. The children's trespassing, once an unforgivable offense, now took on a different hue. Perhaps they weren't just defiant. Perhaps they were seeking escape, a haven they desperately needed, and her pool had inadvertently offered it. Sarah looked, at her barren yard, then at Karen's house, its drawn blinds no longer signaling defiance but a desperate attempt at privacy, a shield against prying eyes. The yapping of Midnight and Sparkle, once annoying, now sounded like a cry for help. Her carefully constructed peace felt like a house built on quicksand. The summer, which had begun with such bright promise, had turned into a wasteland of regrets and unintended consequences. The karmic shock wasn't just for Karen, it was for Sarah too. A chilling realization that her act of vengeance had unleashed a torrent of unforeseen suffering far beyond the boundaries of her own property line. And the thought once unthinkable began to form. What had she truly gained? And at what cost? The weight of Mrs. Henderson's revelation pressed down on Sarah like a physical burden. Mark lost his job. The dogs, a desperate attempt to lift the children's spirits. The puzzle pieces, once scattered and seemingly unrelated, now formed a horrifyingly clear picture of a family in quiet crisis. Sarah's fury, once a raging inferno, had dwindled to cold ash, leaving behind a gnawing emptiness far more painful than any anger. Her carefully constructed revenge, intended to teach a lesson, had instead exposed a vulnerability she hadn't even considered. The yapping of Midnight and Sparkle, once an infuriating drone, now sounded different. It was still annoying, yes, but beneath the high-pitched barks, Sarah imagined she heard a frantic desperation, a mirror to the turmoil inside Karen's house. The once immaculate lawn next door was now a chaotic mess of dug-up earth and wilting plants, a stark visual representation of a life unraveling. Sarah tried to shake off the unsettling feeling. It wasn't her problem. Karen had brought this upon herself, with her entitlement, her dismissiveness, her refusal to respect boundaries. Sarah had simply reacted. But the image of Leo's small, sad face and Mia's heartbroken wail persisted. They were innocent. They were suffering the consequences of a conflict between adults, a conflict Sarah had ultimately escalated. One evening, as dusk settled, Sarah sat on her empty patio, sipping a glass of iced tea, the oppressive heat of the summer still clinging to the air. The air conditioner hummed inside Karen's house, a rare sound. Usually, her windows were open, allowing the sounds of children and the smell of dinner to drift over. Now, a suffocating silence emanated from next door, broken only by the intermittent, muffled barks of the dogs. A faint, almost imperceptible sound drew her attention. It was a soft, rhythmic sniffling coming from the other side of the high privacy fence. Sarah froze, her tea glass halfway to her lips. It was Mia. Quiet, heartbroken sobs, punctuated by small, shaky breaths. The sounds were so small, so vulnerable, they tore at something deep within Sarah. She found herself slowly rising, walking towards the fence, drawn by an invisible thread. She stopped at the spot where the old loose panel had been, now a solid, unyielding barrier of dark wood. She couldn't see anything, but the sounds were clearer here. Mia was sitting by the fence, crying softly to herself. Sarah hesitated. What could she do? What could she say? An apology felt hollow, inadequate after the destruction she had wrought. But to do nothing, to simply listen to a child's quiet despair, felt unbearable. "Mia?" Sarah's voice was a soft, tentative whisper, barely louder than the crickets. The sniffling stopped abruptly. There was a sharp intake of breath, then silence. Sarah waited, her heart pounding. "Is that you, Mrs. Davies?" Mia's voice, small and tremulous, drifted through the fence. "Yes, it's me," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice gentle. "Are you all right, sweetie?" A fresh wave of sobs, louder this time, erupted from Mia. "No, I missed the pool. It was my favorite. And Daddy's sad all the time, and Mommy's always yelling at the dogs, and Leo won't play with me. Everything's bad." The raw, unfiltered anguish in Mia's voice was like a punch to the gut. Sarah leaned against the fence, her head bowed. She had thought she was striking back at Karen, at entitlement, at disrespect. She had never intended to break a child's heart. I know you miss the pool, Mia," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. "It was a really nice pool, and I'm sorry things are hard right now." Another choked sob. "Why did you take it away? Mommy said you took it away because you don't like us." The direct accusation, innocent yet devastating, pierced Sarah deeply. The lie, spoken by Karen, had cemented Sarah as the villain in a child's mind. "That's not true, Mia," Sarah insisted, her voice tight with a sudden surge of regret. I just wanted my backyard to be different. It had nothing to do with not liking you." The words felt flimsy, inadequate, even to her own ears. "But we loved it," Mia wailed, "and now it's gone forever." Sarah stood there, listening to the pure, unadulterated grief of a child, and felt the full, crushing weight of her decision. The victory she had sought now felt like a terrible, irreversible mistake. The peace she had bought was tainted by innocent tears, and the quiet of her backyard was no longer serene but suffocating. She had drawn a line in the sand, but it had washed away more than just the problem. It had washed away her own sense of moral clarity. A new thought, unsettling and uncomfortable, began to form in her mind. It wasn't about Karen anymore. It was about Mia and Leo and the innocent summer they had lost. Could she live with this? Could she truly be at peace knowing the unintended devastation her actions had caused? The answer, echoing in the quiet, sobs from the other side of the fence, was a resounding, painful no. The summer had revealed a truth far more complex than simple right and wrong, and Sarah knew with chilling certainty that this story was far from over.